Hello and welcome to this very first episode of our podcast. This is a podcast made by the members of the Symposion Study Association for Philosophy at Leiden University. My name is Sven, and today I'm going to be talking with Albert about a question that he suggested as our subject for today, and that is why philosophy? Why do philosophy, and why do it academically, and why do it at all? Albert, welcome. You're doing a pre-master here at this university, right?
Yeah, so I did my pre-master here over the last year. I was the pre-master for global and comparative, and I've started a master now. But then along the way, I kind of changed my mind a little bit. I thought, oh, there's really, really cool courses here in continental philosophy, and I do want to do a bit more of those. So now I'm actually, while I've started the master, I'm also doing still the pre-master for modern European philosophy. So right now I have a lot of my plate actually. Like I'm doing almost 50 credits, combining the two. And I'll see how far I can go with this. Because, yeah, I really enjoyed the courses that I can get here. So I'm just trying to get as much out of it as I can.
Right. That sounds like a lot. There's a lot of academic philosophy going on. Me, personally, I'm a third year's bachelor student of global and comparative. And I tend to take some extra courses on as well. I like studying academic philosophy. But actually, what we should probably talk about a little bit is why do this? Why do 50 credits in a semester of philosophy? Why I think this is something that is worth doing? Because I guess the general view or the common opinion, I would rather say, is that people study philosophy because it's kind of interesting, but in the end, there's not much use to it, and they end up working at McDonald's or whatever. What do you think would be one of the main reasons for studying philosophy at a university rather than doing it informally?
Well, I think like there's many reasons that different people might have. And for me, I suppose the thing is, and this makes me want to do so many courses at once in a sense, is that I've done it I think informally before, and I think I will do it informally again. And this is just a period of my life where I actually am in academia, so I want to make the most of it because I enjoy it, but I don't think it's necessarily the only way. And so for me, in a sense, if you will, it's like you want to do it in academia because it's one of the ways and you want to try it out, like if you really love philosophy. But of course, most people will not have that reason. And I think there's all sorts of reasons and all sorts of even practical reasons. Like, the graduates don't end up working at McDonald's. They go into all sorts of jobs and in all sorts of ways of life. And they're going to carry whatever they've studied and enjoyed with them. It's going to change them as people. It's going to shape how they think and what they do, regardless of where they're going to end up. So, the reasons could be many. But for me, it's kind of like this. I think I love philosophy. I always have. It's like a path for me. And at this point, it's taken me to academia. So I'm trying to make the most of it.
Yeah, this is, I think you're right. And then there's a lot of ways or a lot of reasons to study philosophy at a university. And I think it's kind of interesting for you. So it's kind of, philosophy is something much more than just, studying books, writing papers, getting grades.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting how you phrase it, that you said, I'll do it informally, and this is just the phase of doing it academically.
Yeah.
And I think for this will count for some people, but I think there's also a lot of people who would say do it quite the opposite, in the sense that this will be the phase that they do philosophy.
Yes, definitely.
And around that do other things that they find practical or find interesting rather in their life. Because I think there's definitely a lot of skills that you get from doing academic philosophy, right? The reading skills and the writing skills most obviously, I think, but specifically like by reading other people's thoughts or ways of thinking, it really is beneficial to figuring out how you want to think and how you can conceptualize certain aspects of life that don't, they don't necessarily have to do with the hardcore philosophy problems, but
Yeah. Actually, I think in some sense, for me, philosophy or an education in philosophy, if that's what we're doing here, is just learning how to think in language. Like that would be even like a narrower definition for me. It's just thinking in language, and involves definitely reading and writing, like you said. But I also think it's a lot about listening and speaking, and that's in some sense more important for me. Like I prefer speaking like this than I do writing, even though they're different and both of them are important, and I think they kind of help. If you do both of them well, then they reinforce each other. But ultimately, I think like speaking is the really fun, and it's kind of where it's at. It's like where philosophy is really happening, and that's something that you always do. All humans always do that. So in some sense, I feel like the education is just learning how to speak, learning how to use language, and then learning how to think. And then even from that, I would say there could be a broader definition where thinking is not limited to thinking in language, but it's thinking, it could be thinking in images, it could be thinking practically, thinking with your hands, etc., etc., etc. And that, for me, in some sense, is what philosophy is about. It's just learning how to think.
Learning how to think, yeah. Well, I think this makes a lot of sense. But so the thing is, what I was thinking while you were talking about language, you would agree with the Platonic idea of having speaking as the primary logos and reading and writing to be secondary, not really capturing the spirit of philosophy?
Yeah, I really like this idea. It's not that reading and writing isn't important. I mean, we've had it for a couple thousand years. It's gonna stay, and it can do a lot of things for us. It can teach us a lot of things. But ultimately, I think where it's really at is, like Plato has this ideal of the living logos, right?
The living, yeah.
And I like that Plato wrote dialogues in order to convey this to us. Like that, in writing, even if you write, and the best way to do it is to kind of simulate a living conversation. So
Right. Yeah, I think this ties in with their... Plato, after all, he started the academy, so in a sense, doing for us to do academic philosophy would be in a succession. But I feel like there is a very different kind of conception of why people do philosophy and what it entails. If you compare the current situation or the current zeitgeist, if you will, from that of Plato himself.
Right, it's a very different kind of academic. For sure. But there is, I think, something of the legacy definitely remains.
Well, so Plato, he wrote in his Phaedo, or at least there he had Socrates talk about why to do philosophy, and Socrates explained to someone, I don't remember this guy, and he said, well, philosophy is really a practice for dying and death, in this sense that he took for granted, first of all, to understand this, he took for granted that death is the separation of the soul and the body, right?
Yeah.
Or soul and mind and body, whatever you want to phrase it, but and in that sense, the way Plato or Socrates thought about philosophy is that in order to get real knowledge, right, to get wisdom, we need to remove ourselves from our bodily passions, or the way in which our body just constantly grabs our attention and needing to eat and shit and whatever, that you will always be deceived by your bodily senses. And so the aim of the philosopher is to get rid of that confusion and think clearly, have pure thoughts, and that because death then is a separation of the body and the soul, this doesn't need, at least first of all, it doesn't need to be concerning to the philosopher, right? Because when he dies, he'll probably get all the knowledge he's been looking for all his life. Because now he's pure soul, and he won't be bothered with bodily illusions and stuff like this. But secondarily, also that philosophy, in a sense, is this preparation for death, because we try to think in a pure manner, separate from our bodily intuitions or our bodily passions, and in that sense we already purify ourselves for the moment when we actually do get ripped away from our physical existence.
Well, I guess I can come back in on that, because I think this idea is fascinating, and I think that I, in a sense, agree with Plato. I really like this conception of preparation for death, but I don't necessarily agree with the particular theoretical framework, right, of the soul and the body and their separation. And
there's
this
a lot
idea.
of assumptions there, true.
Yeah.
In this story, at least, that I told.
But perhaps I can say like what my own take on it would be,
Yeah.
and perhaps even I would even try to interpret this into Plato, because I think Plato's dialogues are so open to interpretation that you can always dispute, was he really a dualist in this sense? You can have debates about that, but that's not really important. But what I would say for myself is that I think this relation to death is fundamental, even if you don't assume that you will then continue on as a pure mind or something like that, because it's just this moment of death, or like this inevitability that you will be confronted with, which will fundamentally transform the way you think or something like that. And I think it makes sense that you would want to have the greatest possible ability to understand and think and reflect for when you're gonna face that. So it's I don't know, it's a very deep and strange idea in a sense, but I think there's a lot to it. And I think there's a reason why it comes back throughout the history of philosophy. And just the first thing that comes to mind is Heidegger and his being towards death, right? For him, this is super important, that like we always live in this relation to the finality. And I think in some sense, that's what philosophy is about. It's like this question that arises from that looming over you.
I mean, I think this makes sense to me personally. I don't really think of myself as preparing for death when I do philosophy. When I sit down and I open the Critique of Pure Reason, and I was like, oh yes, I need to do some preparation. But I mean, there's of course a sense in which in philosophy we are in we're in a search for knowledge, but in a sense it's more about meaning, I think, than knowledge itself. And meaning, of course, does only gets only created in life when there is an end to it, because without there really wouldn't be a point of doing philosophy. If you wouldn't die, then there wouldn't be a reason to make sure you spend your time well, basically.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. Yeah. But I guess you could argue against that. But I think in the end, it's not really a question for us. Like, we are mortal. I guess, now there are people who are trying to become immortal with the latest technology, etc. But I don't think it's ever going to happen. And I think it's absolutely fundamental for us as human beings that we face this in some way. And so I think basically, when we talk about philosophy, it's a human activity. And so it's a mortal activity, it's like you always think as a final being, as a limited being, as a perishable kind of process. And so I think that will and should be reflected in what you're actually doing with the thought.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in that sense, I think philosophy can help you place yourself a little bit in the world. If you can think about the world in a structural sense, and see who you are within that structure, to be that finite little monkey running around who happen to be able to use a lot of fancy words. But I think this maybe comes back to this idea about language being very important again, that I think we can get very easily constricted in our own thoughts and our own systems of thinking, and philosophy can be a tool to loosen your views on the world a little bit and help you harmonize your your direct experience of just being this human being on this world, walking around, having to do groceries and whatnot, to harmonize that with your more structural thoughts that, you know, that can give a real peace of mind if you're able to do that. And I think philosophy definitely can aid in that, and to help you find a structure that explains your experience such that you understand it, rather than be just taken by surprise every time you step around a corner.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think it relates to the point about death. Then in some sense it would be like, it's about making your thinking align with the reality of your life and death. And bringing it into some kind of harmony, like you said, with it, or some kind of mutuality, where you meet life with your thinking, something like that. I like that idea a lot. Yeah, I guess like we're having a pretty abstract debate about the meaning of philosophy for life or something, which I think is fun.
Yeah, this is true. I think, I mean, in that sense, we are maybe not the most diverse two people to be talking about why we do philosophy. Because I imagine if I look around the university, and I also see a lot of people that, you know, they're interested in philosophy for sure, but I don't see them do philosophy later in life, for example. Whereas for myself, I feel like I found something here, you know, in studying philosophy, and I don't need to do it academically, but you know, it's something to do in this life. So
yeah, I definitely. Yeah, it's true that we are similar in that sense. But maybe I would say two things to that. And the first is that in my own experience, I think I already did philosophy before I ever came to do it at university. Of course, yeah, I had like philosophy classes at high school, and I read some philosophy books, and that definitely shaped what it meant for me and why I would, you know, say that I did it. But I wasn't doing this, what I'm doing now, at least not in the same sense.
Yeah.
But I still think I was doing philosophy. So I think there's many ways to do that. And in relation to that, then I would say that perhaps a lot of these people that you're describing, you know, they don't think that they will, because they won't stay in academia and they won't be teaching it, and they won't be reading a lot of, you know, books that we think of as philosophical. But they will still go around their lives and keep on doing and thinking in a different way that'll be shaped by their engagement with it. And yeah, I think in some sense, like any activity could be philosophical if it's for them informed by this intense relation to life to life and death, actually, that we were talking about before.
Right.
So it's almost more like an attitude than an actual activity, you know, and that the attitude would make any activity philosophy.
but what kind of an attitude is that then? Is it does it have to do with like being inquisitive and stuff like this, or what do you mean about? Because for me, really, philosophy is an activity. So I'm quite curious that you would describe it as not as an activity, but.
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting on very shaky ground, because I think I generally tend to have this, that I tend to dilute the meaning of words to the point where, you know, because I'm like, oh, it's not limited to just this. I want to say it also has these other meanings, it's important for these things, but I kind of dilute it to the point where it includes everything. So I think I'm definitely in danger with doing that with philosophy. You know, I could just say, oh, human life by nature is philosophical. Like everything is philosophical because you always think, and you're always faced with fundamental questions that you're kind of trying to answer, and maybe you're not answering them by reading a treatise, but you're answering them with your job or with your relationships.
Okay, but I do think there is a real difference between, I mean, I think there are people that are unphilosophical, or that live their lives without philosophy in any sense of the word.
And if there weren't, you know, then there wouldn't be any meaning to the word. That's what I'm saying. So I shouldn't go too far with this. But I guess I would settle on like a middle ground, which would say that, that this attitude that I'm talking about is one definitely of questioning. I agree with that. It's kind of like an inquisitive mindset. I think it definitely includes wonder. I think that for me is absolutely fundamental to philosophy. This sort of openness and interest to things, like not taking things for granted, not thinking that you've quite understood them, but always seeing that there's a little bit more there that interests you and that you could pursue further. So, and it definitely has to do with this cultivating thinking in some sense. So it doesn't have to be, strictly logical or philosophical in the traditional sense, but kind of reflecting on your thinking and working with it actively and consciously and transforming it. And then I would also say, like, having the relation to these fundamental questions, like basically the meaning of your life. That's the most stereotypical, but I think is the most important, and it's the one that these unphilosophical people that you describe, they kind of put aside. They're like, I don't need to worry about this, I'll just go about life. But I think the philosophical attitude is like, basically you constantly do, everything you do comes back to this question in some sense.
Yeah, I see. I think in that sense, what sparked a thought in what you said is, I started thinking about how philosophy can bring a kind of humility to your life.
Yeah.
In the sense that when you are set on learning new things, that brings you a lot of humility, in the sense that you'll realize there's a lot of shit that you don't know.
Yeah.
And a lot of stuff that you realize that you maybe were sure about, but maybe shouldn't be sure about, right? And I think this, is basically just describing the process of learning, but encountering some new view or some new idea that doesn't correspond to your set view of the world. It hurts a little bit, because there is something out there that will deny something that you thought you were. I'm really this kind of person who believes in justice. And you feel good about that, and then when you encounter philosophy,
for me.
Exactly, and then there's some philosopher, well, what I think justice is, and you're like, oh shit, all right, it really isn't just one concept. It's really complicated, and that'll hurt a bit, because this little piece of you that was proud for being someone who really believes in justice will have to, admit that he doesn't know shit, and you need to find some new idea that you would agree with more. And this process of finding new truths, in a sense, that will make you have to let go of your little parts of your identity.
Yeah.
I think this is very valuable in the sense that, yes, it is a little bit painful sometimes, but if you can get into that process, it's the way to learn. It's the way to really improve. And then in that sense, I think you see another, or maybe the same aspect, in which philosophy can really help someone's personal life and really developing them as a person, and being able to learn new things in this life.
Yeah. No, I would definitely agree with that. And, we were talking before about preparation for death. And of course, that's painful in some sense. Yeah, it always involves. I think any kind of true, like, deep, thoroughgoing questioning will be painful, will be transformative. And transformation is always kind of painful, because you have to, like you said, let go of what you took for granted before.
Yeah, right.
I think, like, we could try to, like, bring the point home of what we were talking about up to now, about, okay, like, is philosophy then an activity, or is it an attitude, and what does that mean? And I guess I can say what I would mean by that, like, give an example of an activity that people wouldn't traditionally consider philosophical, but that I think you could very much argue for as philosophical. And for me, the really important one would be art. Like, any kind of artistic engagement for me could be deeply philosophical, in the sense that you are confronted, you are thinking about these fundamental questions, everything that we've been talking about, and your reaction to that isn't to give a rationally structured logical answer, but it's to give some kind of expression of your way of approaching this problem. And I think it's very important, and I think it'll always be related to philosophy in this more logical sense, or something like that. And I wonder what your take on it is, because I feel like you have a different approach from me.
Well, I think I do. I do see there's similarities in the activities of doing art and doing philosophy, but there's also, I think, it is useful to keep them somewhat separate, in the sense that art and philosophy may deal with the same subject. So, for example, well, let's take death again to keep it lighthearted. To keep it lighthearted.
Nice one.
We can philosophize about death, what happens after death, or what death means to a living being, whatever, and we can make art about death. About our realization of death and an expression of that. And although I agree that philosophy is not necessarily strictly concerned with reason in the pure sense, in the Kantian sense, and of just being able to, to have everything according to a strict logic. Although I think that there is some sense in which logic is fundamental to philosophy,
Yes.
but I do think that it's not just propositional logic. There's different logics to be made. People have made them, right? So in that sense, you can have a little bit of Schwung in philosophy, as you have a lot of in art, but I think there is a little bit of a different aim. Like you said, expression, and in a way, art, that this is maybe fundamental to art, to have to express something.
Yeah.
And although I can express things with philosophy, with writing or speaking about philosophy, in that sense, it's a verbal or a linguistic expression in that same sense. But really what I'm doing in doing philosophy has not so much to do with expressing, but maybe structuring impressions. So rather than, I don't think you will only do philosophy once you've written a book that has your idea, and this is how the world works kind of deal. But I am already doing philosophy when I am, I don't know, I have these little mini philosophy thoughts sometimes when I talk to people, and they tell me things, and all of a sudden I find myself just half listening to what they're saying, and on the other half I'm just trying to figure out some socio-cultural structure that is happening in this conversation, right?
Nice.
And but there is a way in which philosophy always they take what is available in the world through our physical senses, and perhaps our a priori thought sense as well, and try to make an categorization and interpretation that can give some structure to all these things. Whereas with art, I feel there is more. It hasn't so much to do with structuring things, but more with expressing intensities of experience, right? You have an intense experience and you make art to get your feeling out, whatever it is, right? And I feel that in philosophy, when I feel like, oh, I really want to express something in philosophy, to speak or to write, then this is not something that, for me at least, is very emotional or it is more like a structure that I've realized. I mean, this can again, it can concern emotions, for example, so it doesn't need to be completely divorced from feeling. It can be very much to do with feeling, but the activity itself is more of a structuring in that sense. And what I've been saying here, it's been slightly what's my own thoughts, but I guess they've been a little bit influenced by Deleuze, who writes. He's got his book with Guattari, What is Philosophy, and he wrote this book like at the end of his life. It's the last book he wrote, and and he starts it as well. It's like, well, who writes a book that is called What is Philosophy? And he's like, yeah, I can really only do this at the end of my life after already having done so much, spent all my life doing philosophy, because it's a very silly question, but it's also a super, super deep question, what philosophy really is, what the activity is. And the way he sees it, he clearly, he categorizes human activity into these three parts, into art, philosophy, and science. And for him, they are really strictly separate, although they can all concern the same subject, right? They all concern life and the world, but they interact with it in a very different sense, in that they're like the activity itself is a different type of activity.
Okay, that's really interesting. Maybe you can like tell me a bit more about that. I'm really curious about what then his idea of philosophy as separate from both of these would be, because I think my view in some sense, and perhaps this is also going back to Plato again, is that philosophy is like the highest. That's really preposterous way to think about it. But I do in some sense feel that way. That it's
Yeah,
like
me too. I don't really say it to non-philosophy people, but somewhere deep in down, I'm like, I can't believe you're doing physics, man. I mean, there's always one step up, and it's philosophy.
No, I don't mean that. I don't.
Nah, okay, but
what I mean that it's okay in this Platonic view. Let's say it's like the highest level reflection on life or something like that, on
right.
reality. And in some sense both science and art are subsumed within it, like they are kind of like instruments or branches of it that this highest relation uses. I mean, that's a really bad way to put it, because it's not using, it's not reducing them to just instruments of philosophy. That's not what I want to do. But basically, I think philosophy can work with and learn from a lot from both art and science in their independence. But ultimately, what it does kind of involves like all of those things. It doesn't exclude it. There is no boundary which will be like, here philosophy ends. No, like
right.
Philosophy doesn't have an end to its interest. It'll take in the results of science. It can even take in the methods of science, and it can take in I would say this living expression, transformative experience of art or something like that as well.
Yeah.
So I would be interested actually then in his concept, what it is that, this separate philosophy does.
Well, I think he doesn't, the way I understand it at least, I don't know too much about Deleuze, but...
And this was Deleuze and Guattari.
Deleuze and Guattari. And
they collaborated on this book as well.
Yeah.
I should check it out.
The last book they wrote. And basically, how I understand it is they don't really... Like I said, I think they would agree with you that you can do philosophy about everything, right? There is no limit to philosophy in that sense. But they talk more about methodology, about the activity itself, what it is when you're doing philosophy, what is it when you're doing art or science. And here they draw quite a clear distinction in that, for example, where science tries to figure out through an empiric way certain structures in the universe, the way in which the world works, right? And the way in which certain things behave, all this kind of stuff. And philosophy for them is not really figuring out how the world works, but rather figuring out how you should conceptualize or categorize the world. And so for them, philosophy is really the pure activity of creating concepts. And so, again, to me, the way I read them, this really connects back with the importance of language, in the sense that, when we do philosophy, especially the more abstract stuff, we come up with these words. And sometimes I think about this and I'm like, wow, this word, I understand what it means because, I've been studying philosophy, but on its own, it's what the fuck?
You pretend you understand what it means.
What kind of it's just a word, but what is it really about? But, and so Deleuze would say like this is the activity of philosophy, of taking words and explaining what they mean, what they relate to in a conceptual sense.
Okay.
And so philosophy, the concepts created by philosophy could be used as tools in science again. So the way I think of it, let's see if I can think of an example. I mean, I'm making a bit of a stretch here because I'm by no means a Deleuze expert. But if you, for me, the crucial difference, and this is a more personal opinion between philosophy and science, for example, is that where science would ask, how quickly does a molecule spin, or move. I don't even know if that's something that makes sense to say, but you know, they would ask about, oh, this object, how does it behave if certain forces or certain things, certain, you know, what is the causality involved there? Whereas philosophy is about asking, okay, so you've described this electron that is moving there with this charge and stuff. You know, I know how it behaves, but what is it? What is the electron itself? You know, what does this concept mean? Because, you know, no one's ever seen a fucking electron before. So really, what is it, right? I mean, we know that it behaves in a certain way. And in that sense, philosophy structures the world into hierarchies of concepts. Or, I mean, and there's very different ways of doing this, of course. And, you know, different philosophers have done it in very different ways, but ultimately it's about this, about, you know, understanding the logos, really, if you will.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, but I feel that in order to understand the logos, you cannot limit yourself to just working with concepts and language in some sense. And maybe it's a ridiculous idea. And I do like this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that I completely agree with Deleuze, and I'm not saying that I will have, you know, faithfully represented him here. But yeah, I mean, I think that there definitely needs to, you know, philosophy needs to take experience as its basis in order to do conceptualizing. And this is something that gets lost very quickly once you get into, you know, very abstract structure building that the great philosophers have done, perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I like this a lot. I like this emphasis on the fundamental meaning of the words and yeah, highest work with language or something. But I guess I have like a different idea, and maybe this could bring us back a little bit to the distinction between academic and, you know, academic philosophy and philosophy as a way of life in the modern world, or something like that. And for me, the problem is that in some sense, philosophy has to be, and perhaps more so even than art or science or anything else that you could do. In some sense, it has to be like the most personal and the most practical thing that you do. Like, it's answering fundamental questions, but these are questions that are like intensely fundamental to you. Like, you need to, in order to be a philosopher, you need to have this like deep psychological urge to engage with this on a personal level, and I think we've kind of already indicated this in our previous discussion, to like transform yourself in what you are. And this to me is absolutely fundamental to philosophy. So in order to understand the logos, it's not just that you stay the same and do some work with concepts which clarifies it for you. It's that you transform yourself to the point where you are like this different thinking activity. Like, your thinking is so different that it's able to grasp these things in a different way. And in order to transform yourself in this way, there could be many different things that you do, which are not just reading and not just working with language. I think that's fundamental. I think it's always, like you say, like logic and language, and this is sort of in the word logos, it will always have a fundamental place in philosophy, but I don't think it'll ever be the only thing that it does, because in order to transform yourself in this way, you might also need many other, let's say, disciplines or activities. And I would include art in this. I would include perhaps more like empirical science in this, and it could be many other things. You know, there could be physical activities involved in this, which is why I think, for example, in the academy they also did, like, you know, wrestling and all this Greek stuff, and there could be, I would also, you know, this is something that we haven't touched on much. It's kind of in the background, but we could talk about relation also to spirituality and religion. And I feel like in, you know, this sort of self-transformation is a fundamentally, how would you say it, spiritual exercise in some sense, and it will involve something like meditation, you know, something like prayer in the Western tradition. This, which is, you know, related to philosophical thinking, but it's not really that in the same way.
Yeah, right. Well, this is quite interesting because I think there is, in a sense, I would say that everyone who does philosophy with any seriousness, I mean, not necessarily academically, but people who take philosophy serious, you know, there must be some urge, right? Like you said, some deeper drive. And I think in a sense this will usually be of spiritual origin, this need. And probably people will say, no, not for me, I'm not in this way. And but what I mean is that it's not like you need to be searching for God in order to really do philosophy. Not at all. But
yeah, I don't want to say that either.
But there is a way in which, even if you are this hardcore analytic logical positivist who just thinks about logic and language and things need to go in boxes, then maybe that came from some kind of a need to be able to put things in boxes to make sense of your life, right? And and in that sense, I think there will always be some kind of personal origin or personal reason for why you think the kind of philosophy that you do is so important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's good that it's then open and there's a huge diversity of ways of doing it, and different traditions which approach it in different ways. But I guess for me, I would in my own bias of my own way, I would say that anyone who limits themselves in philosophy to only strictly analyzing the logical meaning of words or something like that, now I'm butchering it, but something like that, isn't gonna get what they're looking for, because they need more than that in order to meet this urge to understand, because like I say, because for me it's a transformation and there's many ways that are involved in something like this.
Yeah, I see, but I don't think everyone will agree with you on that.
Absolutely not. No, I wouldn't want them to agree. I think it's the diversity and the disagreement is a big part of what actually makes this possible and cool.
Yeah,
so,
of course,
yeah,
of course.
I don't want to impose it on anyone. I'm just putting my own approach out there, I guess.
Yeah, I heard a nice joke in class the other day. Well, it's not really a joke, but it's more of a comment that all analytic philosophers, they're really wannabe mathematicians. And all continental philosophers are really wannabe artists, but neither really succeed in either.
Yeah, it's very true actually. So in that sense, I'm definitely a continental philosopher.
Yeah. Me, personally, I'm a little bit more on the analytic side, but I like the I don't know, how do you say? I like the joie de vivre of the continental philosopher, right? The passion and the kind of questions, the continental philosophers usually more concerned with, in my opinion, more fundamentally philosophical questions, that is to say, whereas the analytic philosophers, they tend to get stuck on these little puzzles of logic and rationality, which is interesting in its own right, but kind of misses the point for me for why I do philosophy.
But I think that we've been talking about so much about how this is a preparation for death, and it involves radical transformation of your thinking and engaging with these like most intensely felt personal problems. So it's like a living activity, and this for me is fundamental, and that's what I see you sort of getting at there.
Right. Yeah, I think I don't know about you specifically, but for me, getting into philosophy was really about helping myself understand experiences better that I had, and gaining the linguistic and conceptual tools. And in that sense, my urge came from having certain psychedelic experiences and realizing that there's really something very important going on in these experiences, and they've been making me think quite seriously about life and about how minds work and how we perceive things. But I really didn't have any idea on how to talk about this, and I really wanted to talk with people about this, but these are very difficult subjects to get into words. If you have a trip and it's like, oh yeah, it was super cool. Why? Yeah, I don't know, man. Everything was so beautiful. It's okay, but what was beautiful? And getting, it's very easy to talk about people with these on a kind of superficial level, on a kind of psychological level, where oh yeah, I learned so much about myself in this trip, for example. But I really want to understand what it is that is happening when this when you learn these new things. And so I figured maybe I should do philosophy, right? Because there they talk about
Okay.
what the mind is and how things work, and I might be able to get a bit more of a vocabulary straight to be more constructive in my thinking about this.
Can I actually ask you, like, how long ago is this that you've had this like fundamental experience that directed you towards philosophy?
Well, I guess it wasn't really a single specific experience, but more of a series of experiences that
Okay.
I've had in, well, let's see, this was 2016. So this is like 4 or 5 years ago
Yeah.
already.
Okay.
Yeah. And first I started looking into psychedelics myself, like into papers and stuff like this. But most of it nowadays, it's very scientific papers, or they're very floaty
Yeah.
spiritual
Right.
papers, right? They're
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, this is my trip report, and I met God, and it's like, yeah, it's that's great for you, but like,
What does it mean?
yeah, what
Yeah.
really happened, I don't know. And on the other hand, there was all this stuff about receptors in the brain, which I tried to get into, but I was like, yeah, but I'm not gonna study physics or neurology
Biology,
just for this,
brain chemistry. Right.
And then I found the perfect way in philosophy.
So before that, you weren't really interested in philosophy. Like maybe you knew about it, you read some books, but you didn't think it was something that you wanted to spend.
Well, no, it was definitely not my intention to study philosophy academically or in general in that sense. I mean, this is the funny thing. By the time I decided to do philosophy and I actually started doing this bachelor degree, I was like, oh wow, it makes so much sense that I should be doing philosophy, right? When I think back to my life and how I thought, and like, oh, it makes total sense. But back then I had no idea. I was just, doing my life, doing a lot of thinking in general. I knew that I did more thinking than others in life. At least this idea I had when I talked to people.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, I never felt like this is something that you can actually spend your time on, to fully do. Although I guess I was exposed to philosophy first when I was probably about 11, 12 years old. I had this crush on this girl, right? And on holiday, and I came back and I kept texting with her, and she told me that she'd been doing philosophy in high school as a subject, but we didn't have philosophy in my high school. And then one day I had to tell a story about myself for English class, and I told I spoke about how I'd been thinking and talking philosophy with this girl, right? And then my teacher, he gave me Sophie's World by Justin Gardner. This kind of it's a great book about the history of philosophy, basically in a bit of accessible, casual, novel kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I know this book as well because actually, like, coincidentally, this is also where my interest in philosophy started, in a sense. Like, I always liked reading. I always liked fiction. And I think even when I was quite, a small child, I was already reading some, like, adult fiction. But Sophie's World was definitely the first, like, explicitly philosophical book that I read. And actually, I think it was about the same time. It was, like, when I was, like, 12. And yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. Actually, I remember I went so far as like to make some notes from it. I even like still have a journal that I took my notes from. Actually, now I take notes in it for my modern philosophy courses because it kind of follows nicely from some of those that I took when I was 12 years old. And also, like, then directly from that, there were some philosophers along the way that interested me. I remember it was specifically Heraclitus and Kierkegaard. I was like, whoa, that's amazing.
Nice.
What do they mean? And so then I actually started looking into it more, and this was when I was like 13, 14. And ever since then, I guess I had in the back of my mind, like, okay, philosophy is something that I like, something that I'll do.
Yeah, it's good. For me, the funny thing is that it didn't really stuck in the beginning. Like, I read the book then, and I thought it was great, and then I continued with my life. And well, the funny thing is, I thought I was going to be an artist. I was going to do art, and I went to art school, but and I had it all figured out. And I quit that, and I didn't know what to do. And then I started traveling to have to do something that was interesting, right? And then and then only later, after I found psychedelics, I started really thinking about things much more deeply again, and realized I needed a big project. And I thought, well, I could go to uni. I still could. So
So
Yeah.
that's funny because, in some
Here
sense,
I am.
we have pretty much the same story. Like, I also had a time in my life where I was really into art. I think it wasn't as intense as you. It was never something that I was gonna do for the rest of my life. But there was a time when that was like my favorite thing. That was like a couple of years after this, like 2 years after this philosophy thing. And then I was just doing whatever. I did my bachelor in history and sociology because I think I kind of thought that I wanted to do something philosophical, but not philosophy because you can't get a job or whatever.
Yeah, of
And then I
course.
also kind of got lost, and I also traveled, and I also had psychedelic experiences, and all of this also finally led me to be like, okay, I can go back to university and do a big project studying academic philosophy. So yeah, it's a very
Nice.
similar story. And I think I've indicated this before. For me, this is not the only way of doing philosophy, but it's an important one. And I feel like here we can do it in a great way. Like, there's great professors. What I love is that there's such a diversity of professors, like for example, the continental analytic distinction that we've touched on doesn't really matter here. And I love that, like a lot of these professors, I mean, you have people from both, or actually people who don't just don't care about the distinction. And I think that's great. But definitely the main thing that brought me here was the global aspect of it, because I was basically on the verge of deciding between philosophy and religious studies.
Yeah.
And I was very interested in Asian philosophies and religions. Well, in the Asian traditions, you don't really have this distinction between philosophy and religion. So I just wanted to study, that. I was interested in it philosophically, but in general. And so I was about to make this decision, and I think I probably, if there wasn't this track in Leiden, I would have ended up going to study religious studies somewhere, and maybe that would have been nice. But I'm really, really glad that there was, because this allowed me to like do it philosophically and to focus on philosophy, but to keep the Asian cultures in the equation. And that for me has been, at the time, it was like the most important thing. Now, after this year is done, I'm actually way focused on the Western tradition. I went quite far in that direction. I think I can try and explain that, but I think it's sort of natural in a sense. At least it was natural for me. But still, I still am doing the global master. I still love it, and I think it's really important. And maybe this is something that I would like to ask you as well, because I think it's important to the question of why do global philosophy? And if we do philosophy, should we do global philosophy? And I wonder if for you, the fact that you're doing actually the global and comparative track, if the presence of the non-Western had any significance to you.
Well, it definitely was a selling point in coming here. I mean, first of all, I was looking for an English language philosophy bachelor, and then I saw this one, dealing with Eastern philosophies as well, and Middle Eastern, and I thought, well, this is great, more stuff, more interesting, more better, but I really see I've changed a bit now too. I've gone a bit more back to Western philosophy in my focus, but still, for example, Madhyamaka Buddhism. For me, this is the shit, man.
Yeah.
Those guys just knew it up.
Right.
So I'm very, very glad that I had the opportunity to learn this and had access to people who can explain this, because especially, if you want to get into Western philosophy non-academically, in a way, I think it can be a bit easier because there's guidebooks and there's a lot of secondary literature that you can do that will be quite accessible to anyone who hasn't acquired the right vocabulary yet, hasn't done philosophy. Whereas Eastern philosophies, I noticed, their own texts. I mean, of course, there's also a lot of secondary literature there, but the really trying to grasp what these people, the original thinkers, what they were saying, I think requires quite a bit of interpretation at times. And this is, makes it a lot easier if you have a professor who's been, doing this work for 40 years or whatever, who knows what he's talking about in that sense. But I think for me, this is doing global philosophy is good in the sense that it broadens your horizon. It's also, I don't know. I think it's it's nice because it'll open you up to different lines of thoughts and lines of thoughts that have been developed in the West, but much later, and actually really positions that have been neglected in the West. But I think there's really two ways of doing global philosophy, or global and comparative philosophy. So there's this book we had to read in I think the first or second semester of the first year of the global and comparative track, called Doing Philosophy Comparatively by Tim Connolly. And he talks about two ways of doing comparative philosophy. And it is either taking a constructive approach or an interpretive approach. So like I said, now what I mentioned is that these Eastern texts, often they need quite a bit of interpretation, especially for someone who, is not been brought up in an Eastern culture. And a lot of work in global philosophy goes into interpretive projects. So really trying to figure out, okay, so this guy wrote this sutra or this text or whatever, but what did it really mean? What's really the philosophical position? What did this philosopher or try to say? And I think these are interesting questions in their own right, but for me personally, that is not what philosophy is about. That's just, it's just hermeneutics. It's just trying to figure out the history of philosophy rather than doing philosophy. Whereas for me, really the valuable part of doing global philosophy is going for a constructive approach. And so not really focusing on whether you've successfully and faithfully reconstructed this view by this Indian thinker or this Chinese thinker or whatever, but really saying, okay, I see him say this is my understanding of it, and I don't really care whether this is historically accurate. Maybe he didn't mean this, but on this view, it can be very helpful for me to solve this problem. And in that sense, I think this I found very interesting in doing as well, and writing papers about, where there is ways in which an Eastern philosopher can help a Western philosophy problem,
Absolutely,
and vice versa as well. But I think really there's a lot of value to be gained there. Whereas you need to let go of this idea of having to understand perfectly what is being meant. It's really about doing your own philosophy after.
I like this distinction, and I think I agree with your emphasis, but well, it seems to me that you need some balance of both, right? Like you need a reasonably good interpretation that you then go work with for solving your philosophy.
Of course. I mean, like I said, I mean, it's a personal opinion. I mean, I think doing interpretive global philosophy, it can be interesting in its own right,
and also really valuable for you, because then you can read the book of the person who did this and use that for your constructive.
I'm glad there's people who spend lifetimes translating those texts so that I can think about the ideas. Of course, it's very important.
But I like this distinction a lot, and I'm definitely on your side. Like for me, it's all about well, in some sense, it's about seeing the fundamental problems in all traditions. I don't know, like seeing the similarities and the differences between them in all their wealth and wonder, and then combining all of them to, meet this fundamental problem that we've been talking about your own life and death, or whatever it is that the problem is that you're dealing with. And I think it's absolutely great for this. And you mentioned the Madhyamaka Buddhists, and I think that's a great example. It's like one example for all. Like if your philosophy course doesn't teach Nagarjuna and you've never heard like these arguments and these positions, then you're missing out a lot. And you're actually missing out a lot that is relevant to modern philosophy. Whether it's in the analytic or the continental tradition, you could really benefit from this view. And maybe an example that I could give of that for myself, like I said that I'm very interested in religion, and this is always on my mind, even when I'm doing philosophy. I feel like one thing that's, for example, about the Buddhists that is really interesting, right, is that they don't have this, they don't have an equivalent idea of soul and God that we had in the Western tradition. And in fact, they reject it in a similar way to how modernity rejected it in the West. I mean, that's putting it very simplifying it and putting it very strongly. But for me, it's very interesting to see a whole tradition that basically rejected this idea in the way that people are rejecting now, and yet addressed itself intensely to these most like fundamental and practical questions of the meaning of human suffering and even some like extreme spiritual like depth, but while being how would you say, like anti-theological or something in a way that you could compare to the modern. And I think that alone shows you that there's a lot of space for you to draw on when you're doing philosophy in the 21st century, even from someone who wrote 2,000 years ago in a completely different place. So yeah, I think it's amazing. And also something that you mentioned where, just the value of having like good professors who can explain it to you.
This is...
And I think that's like absolutely fundamental. And I actually didn't quite finish my story, because before I was saying the story about how I had all these doubts about doing philosophy in academia, and I really had to justify to myself that this is really my decision, and I really stand by it. And I feel like best way to persuade yourself of something or to clarify something to yourself is to talk to someone else about it. And so I was talking to my friend, and I was like, in the end, I have like 3 main reasons why I'm going to Leiden to really study philosophy academically. And the first one is that there are professors precisely like who can teach me this better than any book could, because they'll be teaching me to this live in the living logos that we've been talking about, and I can ask them questions in real time and engage with their mind and get all this amazing knowledge from them. So that's definitely one. Then the other was what I already mentioned, what we already discussed a little bit, and this is why I came to this point, is that I will be surrounded by people who have the same passion that I do and who I can share with, both talking about the same courses that we're doing together, etc., but also just living together in this philosophical attitude, just being friends and going for beers or going to the beach or anything that you do together, eating food, but in this philosophical approach to life. And I think that's great. And it's not that I haven't met a lot of people who've had that, and I don't have great friends back at home who have that, but it's different to just be completely immersed in this community. And this is what I absolutely love. And this is also what I said to my friend. And then the third one was that, and I think this is really important for me, is that it's kind of an excuse to really force yourself to do it. Because like I said, I was basically philosophizing before. I was reading books on my own that I was interested in. I was writing, I was thinking about these things. But I could never bring myself to the same intensity of doing it on my own that being in academia brings me to. And definitely part of it is, the first 2 points that I already mentioned, being surrounded by professors who inspire you and being surrounded by other people who do it with you. But there's also just the system, the system that I, in a sense, disliked so much before. I actually think is great for me because I use it as an excuse for myself to actually do it so much. When I take on 50 credits, I actually have to read all of that stuff, and I would never do it. I would never do it on my own. But when I am in this system and I actually enroll in uses and all of this, then
it helps you focus, man.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's how I see it. The system is something that that is helping me,
it can work as a motivation.
Exactly.
For sure. All right. Okay, so why philosophy? I think whether or not you do philosophy academically, it will help you be critical of your surroundings and your life and your thinking. And in that sense, it will help you develop fundamental life skills for being able to navigate this booming, buzzing confusion of a life that has all these experiences and all these ideas and all these formal structures that you get encountered with. And so really familiarizing yourselves with this way of thinking in which you question positions rather than accept them, I think is essential to to living a life that you can be satisfied with.
That's beautiful, and I like how practical it is. It actually speaks to our own times, and I think the answer I will give is much more like way out there and overblown, because I just remembered I was reading Husserl selection from the Crisis of the European Sciences, which I found pretty nice. Like I thought late Husserl actually kind of learned to write, and it was a fun read. And at the end of this selection that our professor made for us, he was kind of talking about, so he's established that phenomenology is like the proper way to establish philosophy and science and blah, blah, blah. But why, really? Why should you really do it? Why should you really try to understand what he calls the life world, like the fundamental ground of all knowledge and life? And he says that you have to, like, you don't have to spend your whole time on it. Not everyone has to spend your whole time on it, but it's really, really important that someone does it, that someone really addresses themselves to understanding the basis of it all and the meaning of it all. And he ended this by saying that it is a task that we have by virtue of being human beings. And I think that's really how I feel, like ever since I was a child, in some sense, I'm just thrown into this strange world of experience, like you said, like you described, this booming, sort of swelling mass of experiences, as a creature, as a being in a world of other beings, and I'm always wondering, like, what is it all about? And as I go through life, I discover that I cannot live in any other way but a way that addresses that, a way that engages with that. And that, I think, is what philosophy is, and why you have to do it, in a sense, why I have to do it.
Yeah, I think in that way, the type of questions that philosophy is concerned with is really inescapable. I mean, you can ignore it, but you cannot escape them. The questions will be there. You might not, spend your time on them, but they are there in virtue of being alive, and they're not going anywhere.
Right. By virtue of being a living being that also will end at some point.
Yeah.
Like
this podcast will end at some point.
Nice.
I think. Yeah, I think that's a nice point to round things off. Thank you very much, Albert.
Well, thank you for sharing all of this.
Yeah, no, it's been great. And thank you for listening to this very first episode of this podcast. We will have more episodes, of course. And in these episodes, I probably will not be your host, but someone else of Symposion and the podcast committee will be hosting this show. And we will be having a different conversation with different students at Leiden University, talking about different philosophical stuff, probably a bit more specific than we have today. We've had very general conversations, of course, about philosophy itself. But we will also dive into specific subjects or specific thinkers, together with other students of philosophy here at Leiden University.